I'd like to welcome you to this afternoon's launch of Craig Taylor's compelling oral history of the New Yorkers, the city, and its people in our time. On behalf of the Protection Island Library, I would like to thank the Protection Lions Club members Rick Miller, Emily Barnwell, and Peter Fruin for making the launch possible. And thanks to Window Seat Books for bringing in the book, and please know they have more in the store. Craig grew up in Lanceville and attended Malaspina College. It was in London, England that he published Return to Aikenfield, A Million Tiny Plays About Britain, which last year was adapted for stage. The Londoners, The Days and Nights of London Now, as told by those who love it, hate it, live it, left it, and long for it. A monumentally successful oral history. He's also the editor of the very fine online literary magazine, 5 Dials, which I encourage you to read. After the enormous success of The Londoners, Craig turned his sights on New York City. He spent 7 years patiently interviewing over 180 people, filling 71 notebooks, and taping 40 hours of conversation. The New Yorkers record skillfully juxtaposed interviews with 70 people. The reader will move through the city with a dancer, a blind singer, spend a terrifying time on top of the Empire State Building with an electrician, experience Hurricane Sandy, homelessness, and so much more. Enthusiastic reviews of his book can be found in major papers and reviewing journals by distinguished writers and critics. After hearing people reading some of the interviews on the March Zoom book launch from New York City, a friend called and said how poetic the interviews are. That is not by accident. Michael Faber has said that Craig has fused mundane truths of conversation with the higher art of truth. He's an exceptional craftsman. He has channeled the city's voice, its vibrancy, diversity, and resilience. Please welcome Craig Taylor.
Thanks, Thora. I hope everyone can hear me. Sounds good. Well, it's nice to do a hometown show here on Pro Isle. Thank you to Rick and to Emily and to Peter for setting this up. I'm just one voice in a long and exciting series that's been going on. Andrew Cameron last week was amazing too. And thanks to Thora, who's always been my inspiration, who's been at these book launches since I started holding them. And I can trace my love of books back to her bookstore on Bastion Street. And I have many great memories of that place and of Thora and Jerry there. Yeah, it's really great to be talking to you all, because I know that I'm just one of a big community of writers and editors on this island, and I'm very thankful for that. So I know Valley is here, David Essig, Allison Watt, Brian Harvey, Louise Hamilton, Sue Goldswain, and Bob and Nancy Turner. And with my own work, I was thinking a lot with this project about Nancy's work. We're quite different writers. I'm not talking about the plant world, but especially with this book, New Yorkers, I was really trying to focus on how to convey knowledge in a way that's respectful to those who are sharing it. And I know that Nancy's been a real inspiration when it comes to that. So today, I'm going to take up a little bit of your time. I'm going to talk a little bit about the origins of, I'm going to read a little bit from it. And while I'm reading, we're going to have a slideshow of some beautiful photographs of New York City taken by Mayita Mendez, who is right over here. And then I hope we'll have time for some questions if people want to post questions in the chat. I think that's the best way to do it. So this is the book, New Yorkers, that I'll be talking about, with its beautiful cover design showing off the different subway lines in the great city. as Thora mentioned, I've written 2 other oral histories. The first one being Return to Aikenfield, which was about a small village in Suffolk. That was done in 2004. And Aikenfield was a book that came out in 1969, so I was revisiting that village. And then I went to the big city of London and did Londoners, which was, as I like to think of it, a sort of nonfiction novel with 80 different narrators who happen to be real people. And this book, New Yorkers, is much the same, a different city, but a same sort of format, where all of these different people from all walks of life chime in with their opinions and descriptions of their lives, of how they live in this great and powerful and somewhat scary city. So the idea with these books is to sort of take the raw data of the world and shape it somehow. Oral histories are, to me, a very fascinating form because, unlike conventional nonfiction, you are depending on the subjects for poetry. You're not able, in a lot of ways, to inject your own words. So you are eliciting and listening to people. And because of that, these projects take a very long time. This one took about 6 years. But I feel that the poetry in them is sort of hard won in a way. It belongs to those who speak it. And my job is to listen to that and to find ways of drawing that out of people. The author in these projects is there sort of in outline. You get a hint of me in these books. You can see me as a listener, you can sense my presence sometimes, but the focus is really on the people themselves, the vernacular of the city. And in New York, as you can imagine, and for anyone who's been there knows, the vernacular of New York is lively, it's vociferous, it's something to behold, full of profanity as well most of the time. So that for me is a great way of telling stories, because you are depending on this voice that cannot be manufactured. I certainly can't speak like these people. So I hope that there's a sense of authenticity that comes out in these books. You may not like some of the people speaking, you may not agree with their politics, but they are there in this city. They belong there just as much as the person you'll encounter in a couple pages. And so in that way, the books, I hope, are sort of a democratic view of these cities. People are given their chance to speak. And I hope that I'm not passing judgment on them, but just allowing their views to come out in the book. And then the question is, how do these voices work with each other? How do they work against each other? What sort of themes emerge? What kind of resonances emerge? In some cases, the same story is retold. There's a man who's a meditation instructor who starts telling a story of his life, and then his father comes in and retells that story. And so I'm always interested in the ways that these novelistic practices can be used in a nonfiction book. And that way, I feel like the storytelling becomes richer. We get to see this city, this subject, from all of these different fractured views. And hopefully, in some way, a coherent picture arises. I do always say that these projects are failures. They have to be failures in some ways, because there's no way of capturing something as dynamic as a city. But at the very least, they should hint at the polyphonic nature. They should hint at the fact that these are places where everyone can find some sort of place for themselves. So the book itself is really about the vibrancy and resilience of New York. As was mentioned in the intro, it took a very long time. It was about 200 interviews, something like 400 hours of conversation, though I try not to think about the numbers and the stacks of transcripts. There were no real questions that I asked. The idea was to just let people go where they might, trust that people will want to talk about their lives, what they do, what animates them, what's important to them. So over the course of the book, you hear from a nanny and a sommelier and a dog walker and a lice consultant who's very busy plucking the lice from the heads of children in New York, an elevator repairman, a 911 operator, window cleaner. And so I was really keen to show the dignity in all of these jobs. You know, a city like New York is run by people who often don't show up on the news or in the newspaper, but for me, provide a way of looking at a place through their own particular prism. For instance, the lice consultant was telling me just how much lice has changed over the past 30 years while she's been plucking it from the heads of children. And it just made me think of the fact that in a place like New York, we are not the only mammals there. There are other beings there, both seen and unseen, that exist alongside of us. And to see the city through her profession, I thought was a great way of talking about a city's progression. And why New York? Like, why go to a city? Why celebrate a city these days when a lot of people are moving out? A lot of people are reconsidering what cities are. And for me, cities give us proximity to some of the most extraordinary people. New York especially allows us to be close to those who we might not otherwise meet, to see our other, whoever we are, our other is there. And in these times of great division, of not listening to each other, I think it's incredibly important to go to cities for that reason, to see that our groups, our races, our tribes, our people are not the only ones, that we have to coexist if we're going to solve any of the larger problems that we face. And cities are a great example of how we can do that. And again, the resilience of the place was just shocking. We all know what New York has been through in the last 20 years, whether it's a terrorist attack or a superstorm that washed out parts of the city, up to right now with the pandemic, which certainly hit New York harder right at the very beginning than most other places. And so I was keen to find people to voice those stories, and that takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of work to find those people, to befriend them, to listen to them, and to find the stories that are most resonant, and the angles that are most resonant, because an event like 9/11, September the 11th, has been told and retold. The story has been told and retold so many times. So luckily, in that case, I stumbled upon a woman named Gladys, who was a 911 operator that day, and was able to talk to me about the audio, the sounds of that event, which is something that I hadn't ever encountered before. September the 11th is also spoken about by a first responder, a cop who is now slowly dying of an ALS-like disease that is the result of the toxins that he breathed in during that time. And I was interested in having his point of view because our sympathies can change with different characters too. When he first appears in the book, he is quite a forceful New York City cop, and as you know, right now, policing across the United States is being held up for examination, and rightfully so. So even if your sympathy is not with this person when you first meet him in the book, we then have another moment with him where he tells the story of being on the pile 20 years ago, almost 20 years ago, on September the 11th, and his subsequent fight to live after breathing in those toxins. So these big ticket resiliences can be seen in New York, but I was also interested in smaller types of resilience. There just seemed to be so many individuals who were finding some sort of way to survive in that city. I always talk about someone who's become a good friend of ours, I think, a man named Elliot Carter, who I met early on, who is a recycler who recycles cans, and I got to know over the course of years, and we still are in contact with him, if not daily, then weekly. So the process of learning about these people's lives was not superficial. It continues to this day, and Elliot filled the entire book, but his way of looking at the city through the prism of someone who collects cans and moves through in an almost unseen way is one of the men on the subway wrapped up on the A train, sleeping, that people avoid, that people stay away from. And I felt it was especially important to include the stories of the overlooked in New York, because we have a tendency to overlook a lot of different human beings in the cities that we interact with. The other thing I'll say before I read is that the book is a real story, I hope, of compassion. That was one of the big themes that arose. We all know that New York can be tough. Of course it can. It's a big city. There is violence, there is harm, there are muggings, there are scary moments. But again and again, in New York, I was privy to these memories and moments of people, as I like to think of it, sort of stretching across the chasm, holding on to their fellow New Yorkers when they were asked to do so. And those seem to be the memories for a lot of people that just couldn't be shaken, that were always present in their minds. And I'm going to read a little bit about a meal that I got involved with early on and that I came back to every Sunday. And the man who dispensed the tickets at this meal, which gave food to 1,500 people every Sunday, was a gentleman named Ralph Martin, who became very dear to me, who seemed to me to sort of personify this slightly profane, gruff, yet very emotional, compassionate side of New York. And he talks in his section just about how that for him is it. That's the most important thing about cities and about life. There's just no other question. You're there to reach out to others. And so I hope that theme is the one that comes through in this book, especially because unlike the others, I think I'm much more involved in this project. I'm there as a narrator. I pop up in the book. New York is a city of implication, as I was told many times, and you can't sort of skate over top of it. It will grab you and pull you down. You got to get involved. So that was my experience of the book. So I know some of you, thankfully, have read some of it. I'll be happy to answer some questions afterwards, but I'd love to read out some of it and to share some of these great visuals, which I hope will transport you to this city. So why don't we go ahead with that?
And share screen.
Okay. So this is me popping up in the book about 150 pages in, and I'm talking about this meal that I started going to. After nearly a year of conducting interviews in New York, I learned about a free lunch served on Sundays in the basement of St. Francis Xavier, a neo-Baroque church built in 1878 on 16th Street and 6th Avenue. Over the course of a typical Sunday afternoon, the kitchen staff of the welcome table served about 1,300 hot meals, often meatloaf, sometimes turkey loaf. Those who came to eat or work at the meal would gather outside on the sidewalk beyond the church's gabled portico. The wealthier residents of the Flatiron district mostly crossed the street to stay away from the crowds, but some pushed past with fruit juices in hand and yoga mats under arm. One Sunday I volunteered, and the next weekend I drifted back. I'm not particularly religious, sorry Mom, but I began to look forward to my Sunday mornings. 2 lines fed into the basement, one for men and the other for women, children, and anyone with special needs. One ticket entitled the recipient to a meal, and after eating at one of the long tables, a guest could get his spine cracked by an osteopath, or play one of the 2 pianos set against the wall. Student lawyers offered help with tenancy agreements, and more tickets were available for those who circled back again for another meal, or maybe another meal, and even a 4th. My job at the end of the lunch was to stand by a Japanese pagoda tree that towered over the iron exit gate and bid people goodbye. Various men stood near me on the sidewalk and offered cigarettes for sale. They said, "Lucy's," and I said, "Thanks for coming," and "See you next time." When I was feeling down or discouraged or homesick, I knew I could at least hold the iron gate open on 16th Street. One day, the doorkeeper, Ralph, asked if he could introduce me to someone. He gestured toward a man I'd noticed before, mostly because he walked around bent over at the waist, staring down at the pavement. Joe was a white guy with military short hair, the skin on his hands a mottled combination of blue and pink and red, raw and even blackened around the nails, and the back of his neck tanned chestnut, even in winter. He was so bent, I worried he might headbutt a person or an iron gate. He'd mistakenly headbutted a bus shelter before. Joe watched the behavior of the feet of different guests as he stood, bent over with his hands on his thighs. He watched the pavement, the shins, the footwear, the cracks, the foot movements. When he sat down on a step near my exit gate and finally tilted back, his face emerged, and he surveyed the last of the lunchtime crowd with calm gray eyes. At these moments late in the afternoon, he liked to say he was getting it, as in, oh, I'm getting it now. He often got it from Ralph, the doorkeeper, who took pleasure in making fun of him for coming from Pennsylvania. I'm getting it big time, Joe muttered with obvious enjoyment. Joe had a mouth that flapped because he no longer had teeth. His nose was curved and much broken. He'd served as a Marine in Vietnam, and many years later he'd taken a blow to the head, which had brought on glaucoma and taken away his ability to read. Even while sitting, he emanated both pain and fortitude, and he hated being called Popeye as much as I hated being called the Canadian. Would you like to meet the Canadian? Ralph asked Joe after a bout of giving it. Would I like to meet a Pennsylvanian? Joe responded loudly in a show of willful inaccuracy. Sure I would. Hi, I said to Joe. I'd rather meet a Pennsylvanian, he replied. Regardless, he offered up his hand. Since moving to New York, I had met hundreds of people. Some I knew for the length of a 5-minute conversation. Others sat down with me for hours. Others kept popping up in my life, month after month, because I'd known no one when I got to New York. These became the people I knew. Starting that Sunday, I would stand around talking with Joe for an hour, sometimes 2. He would linger at the gate, smoking a cigarette or just sitting on a concrete block, stretching out time. Week after week, we talked and looked down at the pavement with lots of long pauses in between. His interest was less New York and more the wilderness I'd known growing up. So I told my own story and conjured a few leafy and rocky descriptions of British Columbia. And he responded with tableaus of Pittsburgh, where he'd grown up, and the Allegheny River, and the forests where he'd once hunted. I guess we're both visitors to New York, he said once, pronouncing the name of the city with distaste. One Sunday in May, after several weeks of hanging out at St. Francis Xavier, Joe and I walked around the corner to a coffee shop on 6th Avenue. Joe squeezed his walker into the small space to the right of the door and stacked a couple stuffed plastic bags atop its seat. Do you know what? He asked after he doused his coffee with sugar and collected a stack of napkins. This is the longest I've ever had my hair. It was military short, only when he could afford it. Why can't you afford it, Joe? He told me he was often robbed. He'd sleep on any crosstown bus, completely dead to the world, and his pockets would get rifled. It looks good on you, I said. He gave me a look and then spread out a couple napkins on the table. I'm getting it now, he said. As it often did, our talk soon turned to Joe's time in Vietnam. Joe was a Marine. He is a Marine, he said, because being a Marine is never placed in the past tense. There's a piece of metal in my left leg, he said. It lodged in when he was blown up by a mortar 69, and Joe can still feel the edge. And do you know what I do? He asked me. I pick at it. Can you believe that? I pick at it. Why would any normal person do that? I asked him if he would go to the hospital. He didn't like the so-called care he'd received, the attitude. He had a problem with doctors and nurses. and he had a problem with those who worked at reception, as well as with traffic wardens and police officers and security guards, which was why he was well known in his neighborhood. In the evening, when the traffic on Park Avenue started to abate, Joe would set up camp in the alcove in front of a tanning and waxing salon at Park and 23rd Street. A man who worked at a nearby hotel passed him whatever was left behind by guests. If Joe wasn't careful, the police would question the provenance of these objects. He often gave the NYPD a list of made-up names when they would check up on him in cold weather. Joe didn't like being touched, and the cops often pushed on his shoulder and prodded his blanket at night, so he offered them phony names and told them he'd stay no matter the weather. He didn't react well to cops, doctors, nurses. When we were in the coffee shop, he asked me, "Do you know what the first question is on the PTSD questionnaire?" I said I didn't. It's, "Do you have a problem with authority?" When we finished our coffees, we often stood around outside. Bent over, Joe took a drag on his cigarette, and the smoke drifted up and wreathed his head. The skin of Joe's left forearm was a plasticized swirl where the mortar had hit and peeled the skin away. Sometimes we would talk about the shrapnel still in his body, more than 20 pieces, which would lead back to the subject of Vietnam. Most subjects were in some way related to his time in the Marines. Some of these threads were strong, some slender, but they all pulled him into the past. Vietnam was not just inside him, but nearby, alongside. It revealed itself. I knew New York was big, but this was the first time I saw that it actually contained other places. For Joe, the smell of gasoline brought forth Vietnam, as did the sound of a traffic helicopter. Once a nearby car backfired and Joe threw himself down onto the pavement. He broke his nose. He'd been ashamed. That was the dominant feeling, he said, and he looked around to find out if anyone had witnessed the act. Sometimes, too, we would talk about my family, and then Vietnam, and his hometown of Pittsburgh, and then Vietnam, and then more Pittsburgh, especially that feeling of confidence at a Steelers game when they were up by 14 points at the half. You could leave, Joe said, knowing they'd win. He said that the great athletes walked the streets of Pittsburgh like gods touching down on earth. Once, standing at our usual spot on the corner of 6th Avenue and 16th Street on a warm summer evening after a parade down the avenue, we leaned on an NYPD police barricade. The barricade had been painted such a recent blue that I kept checking my palms to see if the color had transferred. It was nearly 7 o'clock. The staff at the welcome table were long gone. The volunteers were gone. The gate was closed, and the parade had passed. "I wish you'd known me," he said. "I do know you. You know remnants." There's a moment that arrives when you know you've spent too much time on a sidewalk, watching buses pull up and pull past. It was time to go. I didn't want to leave. I was lonely, and I told Joe maybe we should do something else. I'd love it if he came with me around the corner to a bar. He didn't drink, he said. Then maybe a restaurant. Joe couldn't. He said he was waiting on a check. When I told him I didn't care, he told me not to do this to him. So I relented. "I feel embarrassed for you," he said. "You don't get to do that." Joe had started offering me things during our conversations. That day he gave me a metal utility clip for my belt that he'd picked up somewhere. I spent the entire conversation rolling it around my palms, sliding my fingers through it so that they resembled silver brass knuckles. "Why do you get to give me things?" I asked him. "Why can't I give back?" "Don't do that to me," he said. A bus went past on 6th Avenue with an ad for a TV show on the side. Joe read out the text. "We get the world we deserve." "We sure do," he said. "I'm losing weight. Do you know that Stephen King book? Thinner?" I asked. "Thinner," he replied. "Do you have some sort of curse?" "A Vietnamese curse." Just before he got on the next bus, I gave him a hug and followed the lead of Ralph, the doorkeeper, who often said tender things to the people who waited in his line. "Love you." Joe turned around and said, "Love you too, buddy." He pushed a new piece of luggage, a bright pink suitcase, toward the curb. I watched him wrestle it on board. He pushed toward the back of the bus, head down, dragging the case. It was nearly dark. I descended into the subway, where the advertisements reminded me of my hunger. Okay, thank you. So I guess we'll move on to any questions anybody has for about the last 10 minutes. Guess we'll...
Yeah, if anyone has any questions, they can just start talking or put it into the chat box and I can read out your question. It was nice listening to you read out your story. You can get those nice images of New York City.
We had a few technical difficulties with the photos, but hopefully you got to see a few of them.
Yeah.
I have a question, Craig. It's Sue.
Hi, Sue.
Can you hear me? Hi. My question is, how did you take care of yourself with all these tremendously painful and difficult stories?
I think I always come back to something one of the interviewees, Ralph, actually, who worked as a doorkeeper, said. He just talked about how, you know, part of being around others is listening, is being a good thou to someone's I, and so yeah, I tried to keep some sort of balance, and not get too involved or too involved in unhealthy things in the city. But I think books like this have to be about involvement. You just can't stand by, and so and practically I did have an email address, a Gmail address, where I would email where I was going each day, just in case I didn't return back. But yeah, I think it just had to be a balance of getting involved, of being present, of being there in people's lives, but not getting overwhelmed by them.
Okay,
thanks. Oh.
Here's a comment from Nancy. That was amazing, Craig. Thanks so much. What amazing experiences. I think there's another book there. And Rick Miller said, one review said it was good to get an objective view of New York from a Canadian. What does a Canadian see differently about New York that an American doesn't see?
Yeah, there was one review that sort of picked up on that, and I guess in her opinion, it's good to be a kind of outsider, an insider outsider. And I've noticed that with these projects, I understand the language. It's not my second language. I understand the context, but I'm enough of an outsider. Certainly when I was in Suffolk, working on my first book, the people there, the farmers there and the farm workers and the migrant workers, they just thought I was some weird American who'd shown up. And so they were over explaining everything to me. And I think in some of these cases with these projects, you want to be able to ask stupid questions. You want to be able to not assume a lot. And so that works in my favor. And New Yorkers made endless fun of me for being a Canadian, obviously, but that can be a good thing sometimes.
Craig, I have a question. It's Melissa.
Hi.
Hi. Your selection of interviews is so rich. And I wonder if you would speak a little bit about how you found the people, selected the ones that you would interview, shortlisted that to those you included in the book, and then finally managed the expectations of those that you interviewed but did not include in the book.
Yeah, it's quite an organic process. I know that when you start these things, variety is key. So I knew I knew there would have to be a span of people. I've talked about this before, if anyone heard the program yesterday. I've used a list of verbs a lot of the time that just serves as this sort of practical framework so that I have something to go on. So I'm looking for people who are in action, who are doing something, who aren't just thinking about the city. Some of the worst interviews that I conducted were with academics, local historians, people who were just sort of musing on the city and had already worked out what they wanted to say about the city. So for me, I just was more interested in those people who had firsthand experience, who were getting up every day and were making some part of the city happen.
But how did you find them? How did you find them? I mean, you have such an eclectic group. How did you find these people?
Yeah, there's a kind of ghost book of all of my notes that I kept of just. It was just so many phone calls. Unions were a big thing. I don't know if DJ's on here, but he helped me at the very beginning with the Wobblies and with some union people who then could introduce me to window cleaners and doormen. And
Okay.
so there was a sense of getting, talking to organizations and just relying on them. Sometimes I would call up. I got an entree into the world of sewers in New York. And I remember calling up the guy at their office and saying, like, who is the big talker in your office? Who is someone who just, is a loudmouth, basically? And they were ecstatic. They introduced me to this guy who didn't end up going into the book, but he was an incredible talker. And we often know these people in our lives, if we're asked. And then I was just very lucky to stumble upon a few spoke people. I guess I often consider themselves that. They're central and they have many different spokes coming from them. And so one of the most important for me was a personal injury lawyer who's in the book, who just knows everybody, knew everybody, wanted to put me in touch with everybody. He wanted to drive me places and say, hey, this is my friend, he's the writer and he's going to talk to you. And so, you just sort of stumble upon those. And for the people who didn't go in the book, some were sort of hurt, some were relieved, one woman was included in the British version of the book, but not in the American or Canadian version. And some of them had totally forgotten that they'd sat down with me 5 years ago, and it was, they were too busy living their lives to even care. So, but to come back to what I said early on about Nancy and being respectful, I just think you have to be in contact with people, in dialogue with them. Acknowledgements are a big part of these books. Mine didn't go at the front of my book, but at the end, you just want to list everyone you can. And it's very important for people to see their names, to be seen, to be recognized for sitting down, even spending a few hours with me.
Thank you.
All right, Nancy had another question. Craig, did you go to New York specifically to write this book?
Yeah, Londoners was a much more organic book because I was there. I moved there when I was 23, and so I was just living there. But I did go to New York because I had the opportunity to do this project. And I think it's the only. I don't think I would have just moved to New York and hoped for the best. It was great to know that I was there. It was both great and it was slightly terrifying because you have to do this project. And there were many times when it looked like it wouldn't happen. It looked like the book was kind of falling apart. There was obviously a time in 2019 when there was a version of the book done. And then in 2020, we had to reconsider it, reconfigure it because of the pandemic. So yeah, these projects are just, they're always a risk. You don't know who you're going to see, who you're going to talk to. But you can't do it half-heartedly. You have to show up and do a lot of walking and just throw yourself into it. I see another one popped up.
Yeah, from Kate. Were the majority you interviewed and or included in the book longtime New Yorkers? Did you have to get legal written permission from them to include them in the book? What part of New York City did you live in?
So a lot of the people in the book are are born and bred in New York City. But of course, I wanted people with all different types of experience, and the immigrant experience was especially important. There's one of the interviewees right here who spoke about her own immigrant experience coming to New York City at age 5. But I wanted people who had just appeared there, who had to go there, who went there illegally, who had just arrived on a Greyhound bus. I wanted it, the point of a project like this is to be able to include so many different points of view. And so, especially now with what's happening in the US, speaking to the immigrant experience, having people talk about coming to New York, having born and bred New Yorkers talk about how proud they are that New York is still the place that welcomes immigrants in light of what's happened in the past 4 years. That was all very important to include in the book. As far as legal permissions go, yes, every single person had to sign a lengthy release form, and that took a long time with some because they're New Yorkers, they've got opinions, they don't want to give away anything for free. One woman thought that the experience of being in the book was going to be like a Hollywood movie, and so it took a very long time to tell her that nobody really reads books anyways these days, and it would be okay. I eventually got everyone to sign it, but yeah, it's a big, long process. You have to make sure that people know what's happening. And where did I live? I lived at the beginning on West 93rd on the Upper West Side, and then for the last couple of years I was there, I lived on Grand Street down on the Lower East Side. So I was a Manhattanite. Bruce asks if I talked to any swimmers. Well, there's a few accounts of people swimming in the East River. There's Joe, the person I read the excerpt about, talks about swimming out in the East River, but I don't know if the temperature is comparable to smugglers.
Well, thank you very much, Craig, for taking the time to talk to us about your book. It's always nice to showcase our island friends. And I'm just going to share the screen for a moment here. Hopefully you can see a photo. For a second, Grant. Here you can see a photo of Craig's book, and Thora has a few extra copies at her house. So if you would like to get a copy that Craig can sign, just give Window Seat Books a call with your credit card number, and then Thora can deliver you a book. And we've got a couple of other books written by Craig. This one's called 1 Million Tiny Plays About Britain. And he already talked about this one. Where did it go? I think it's this way. Londoners. So he's quite well read. And then Rick asked me to make a couple of other announcements unless he wants to do that. I don't know where he is on here. He was here. Rick, did you want to do the last minute announcements? Are you there?
Go ahead, Emily, you do it.
Okay. The chip truck, these are Fire Smart announcement. The chip truck is coming on April 28th. The bins will be here from April 28th to 30th. And then on May 1st and 2nd, the PI players will be doing the Savannah Sipping Society. So more fun to come. Okay, thank you, everybody.
Can I make one more point?
Sure.
Just for all you readers out there, authors really depend these days, unfortunately, on Amazon reviews and Goodreads reviews and that kind of thing. And so if there's anyone out there who's on Goodreads or Amazon, it's almost like you have to have a buffer of good reviews for some of the stranger ones that show up. So yeah, if you find these and want to help somebody out, please do. I will share one of my great Amazon reviews of all time was a 1-star review that just said, "This book smells bad." And so that's the kind of thing that us authors have to deal with in today's environment. So if you can, please do help out. And also, thank you, Thora, for this New York style cheesecake.